Hey, Argent here. So this will probably piss a lot of people off, but I'm used to doing that and I'm comfortable doing that. I think it's something we have to talk about at a certain point. I think one of the areas that people LARP the most in, for those of you who don't know, LARPing stands for live action role playing. And LARPing is, I guess the original kind of LARPing was people who do Civil War or Roman reenacting or that sort of thing as a form of LARPing. But it kind of went beyond that and it went into D&D, an anime where people will LARP as their D&D characters and they'll get dressed up and they'll fight out battles. And there are Game of Thrones fans who get up dressed up and they have like fake battles and reenact them. And that's all well and good. It's probably a lot of fun. I know some people who do Civil War and Revolutionary War reenacting, and they say it's a lot of fun, and it probably is. The thing is, some people take that seriously. I mean, not just as a historical thing, but they kind of think that the way forward is that we as a society should LARP. That we should kind of have this view of the past, often a very idealized view of the past, and if we could only return to it and just act exactly like they did then all our issues would kind of fix themselves. There's kind of other aspects to LARPing. It's also used as kind of a way to describe a complete societal transformation to something that's abstract and hasn't really been tried, or just kind of shorthand for any really unrealistic, idealistic, often kind of histrionic political actions. Like probably the LARPiest state on earth is ISIS, because it's literally a bunch of random Muslims LARPing that they're a caliphate. They're like, yeah, we're totally a caliphate, and they do stuff like they want to reissue the gold dinar. Islam is just a really LARPy religion in general. Just how histrionic it is, how just over the top it is, how they think it's still like the 8th century or whatever it is they think it is. So one of the areas where kind of LARPing is the most prevalent is in the field of economics. And that's because kind of a disdain for economics, and I guess you could say practical government, is kind of inherent in the right, and in particular the far right. And this goes way back. Kind of an aristocratic value is to show disdain for money, so they would spend a bunch of money commissioning works of art or building cathedrals or engaging in other activities that weren't immediately economically relevant but were of some benefit to society, and kind of to show that you could basically burn money is a way of showing kind of your spiritual superiority. And the Joker does that. That was kind of one of the main points of The Dark Knight. It's kind of a cliche, but it's very true. Some men don't want anything rational like money. Some men want the world to burn. And the Joker burns his money to basically show that he's a better breed of criminal, as he said. That he's not just about money. That he's kind of has the will to power and he's mastered it. So the Joker's not really right-wing, but it's kind of comes from a similar kind of fake noble attitude. And then we kind of get into like the fascist movements, and they had a disdain for economics because they viewed it as secondary to the spiritual and ethnic regeneration of the nation, and they felt that prosperity would follow that. So their economic theories tended to be kind of incoherent. If they had them, it was kind of the developmental state and protectionism and autarky. The economies of fascist states tended to work the best when they were under kind of a more liberal, classically liberal form of economic development. Initially, Italy under Mussolini had a kind of a liberal economy, and it grew rapidly. Nazi Germany went through periods where the economy was fairly liberal. Spain had the Spanish miracle when they basically kind of dismantled like a lot of their LARPy workers, cooperative, and national syndicates, and just kind of liberalized the economy, and it boomed. But there's always kind of been, I guess, kind of among the smarter fascists, there's kind of been an economic pragmatism where it's like, well, if capitalism's good for the nation, then it's good. Then we'll follow it. If socialism's good for the nation, we'll follow it. it's a secondary concern. But a lot of modern kind of far right people take the perspective that not only is economics not a concern, but it should be solely kind of a subject of how we manage the economy to be a subject of kind of a rationalistic first principle. And this is kind of similar to Marxism. In Marxism, we have the idea that economics is based on kind of the dialectical materialism or whatever they call it, and kind of things like GDP, things like employment rate, any things like investment. All these things are just kind of capitalist lies, and that by establishing a communist state, we'll reach a post-scarcity economy, and classical economics will have no meaning anymore. And I think a lot of kind of modern people in kind of our spheres take that perspective. Probably one of the most notable examples of this is Distributism, which is kind of an ideology that people always, I find, move the the goalposts on. Moving the goalposts, for those of you who don't know, is basically, let's say you're playing soccer and you score, but then after you score, they move the goalpost like 30 feet back and they say, oh, actually you didn't score because you were supposed to shoot the ball here. It's kind of like a post hoc changing of the debate so that your opponent doesn't win. And I find a lot of these people basically do that. So like for Distributism, basically the idea is it's based off something G.K. Chesterton and a couple other people said. It's the idea that we should kind of dismantle industry and dismantle kind of the global economy, and we should go back to a state where economics is completely local or mostly local. People grow their own food. You have like a local blacksmith. You have stuff like that. And the thing is, distributism is kind of an incoherent concept. So if you ever call people on it and you're like, well, how would a distributed society deal with issues like economies of scale or businesses that have high capital requirements, they'll either say that doesn't matter, or they'll say you're misunderstanding it, but they won't really explain it. They'll just be like, well, it's not fair. You're misunderstanding distributism. So that's kind of the way I find these arguments often play out. So there's that. Then there's some people who say complete socialism's the only way forward, and then there's people who say we should just get rid of economics altogether and just put no value on it. There's a lot of people who even say modern comfort is evil, modern economic growth is evil. We should actively try to destroy industrialized society and urban society. And people say, well, this will lead to a more pure world, Argent. How can you object to that? How can you object to this return to kind of traditional society and getting rid of the degeneracy of modern economies? Well, I object to it, and this is why we have the thing we have up. What happened in a lot of for most of human history, China and India had most of the world's GDP. They had up to like 80% of the world's GDP. China very early on built a very stable agricultural society. They had a lot of dams. They had a very well organized food distribution system. They had very competently conducted internal trade. They had by and large a better run government than most parts of the world. And kind of in the first couple centuries, China got set up pretty well. But after that, China, kind of because of Confucianism, they have this idea that for whatever, I guess, kind of successes or for whatever positives happen, an equal number of negatives will happen. So China was kind of having a mini industrial revolution under the Song, and was kind of having a lot of exploration and stuff. And a lot of that was brought to an end by the Mongols. But even after the Mongols, there wasn't really a desire to return to growth or innovation. They kind of viewed it as degeneracy. They're like, well, this stuff is really bad. It will destroy Chinese society. It's evil. We can't pursue it. And India and a lot of the Muslim countries kind of took a similar outlook. They saw capitalism, modern science, etc. as kind of Western inventions, kind of Western things. So when the Industrial Revolution happened in the Western world, as we can see here, China went from like 60% of the world's GDP to like 10% of the world's GDP. And I think what you have to keep in mind is populations were a lot different back then. China was a much larger percent of the world's population, if I recall. 1900, Britain had like 50% less people than it did today. Japan had like 60% less people than it did today. And I think you have to keep that in mind because the GDP per capita is a bit different. America's population has exploded, but its percent of the world economy hasn't really declined at all. So just to keep that in mind. So China massively declined even as population growed. India massively declined. So what wound up, if we notice, the only kind of non-Western country here that didn't decline really is Japan. Japan kind of did decline a bit in the mid 19th century, but then around here we have the Meiji Restoration, where Emperor Meiji basically overthrew the shogunate and kind of opened Japan up into the world and said, okay, we're gonna have a nationalist government, we're gonna have a government that's Japanese, but we're gonna industrialize, we're gonna build a modern army, we're gonna build a modern fleet. And kind of unique among non-Western countries, Japan was able to very successfully kind of come to the modern era. And as we can see, kind of after industrialization started growing, kind of from 1900 on, even until like and during World War II, Japan's GDP continued to grow rather rapidly. Keep in mind, Japan was a very small percentage of the world's population back then. But you can see it's gradually expanding even as China and India, which were like half the world's population, continued to just crash and burn. And these societies became extremely weak. And once they kind of came in contact with more modern Western civilizations, they got completely destroyed. Britain completely wrecked India around this time period, took it all over. China got crushed in the Opium Wars. Let me just go to, where's my screenshot on colonial empires? So this is kind of what the world looked like. I mean, this never all existed at the same time. The Spanish colonies had declared independence, but as we noticed, really the only country that never was a colony was Japan. And to a certain extent Korea, but that's kind of because Korea is in the middle of nowhere. And kind of when the scramble started happening, Japan had kind of claimed Korea. But while China was never a colony, you had these huge areas of China that were kind of de facto economic colonies of Western powers. In particular, Britain, which was more or less occupying parts of China and had turned them, like I said, into economic kind of extensions of Britain. So we had this scenario, but it didn't happen to Japan. Unlike continental China, which kind of eventually, because it was incapable, the Qing weren't incapable of modernizing the country. They were incapable of starting industrialization. They were incapable of really building a modern army. They were incapable of kind of moving from kind of Oriental despotism towards a more modern form of government. And that didn't necessarily have to be democratic. You kind of had hybrid governments like the Meiji and, was it Showa? Whatever the Taisho, kind of the pre-World War II Japanese government that weren't exactly democratic, but were kind of a hybrid of old and new. The German government was kind of like that. But China wasn't able to really modernize at all. To a large extent, it was out of fears from Xi Jinping, whatever the name of the Empress Dowager was, who kept killing emperors who attempted any sort of reforms. So China became just extremely weak as time went on, to the point where these vastly smaller countries were just destroying them on a regular basis. And China, to a large extent, because they couldn't modernize, sub-factions of China that could get kind of outside influence, and eventually this was kind of what happened with the Communist Party, and kind of did adopt more modern methods of doing things, became much more powerful than the Qing were. And the Qing eventually fell to a large extent because all the modernizing factions, be they liberals, be they kind of proto-fascists, be they even kind of conservatives, nationalists, communists, all collectively kind of came together and overthrew them, and they were really incapable of doing much about it. And then we kind of had decades of civil war in China, where to a certain extent the various factions were very strongly influenced by outside forces. You had Sun Yat-sen, who I remember Mad Monarchist was talking about how he would go to the tombs of the emperors, of the Ming emperors, wearing a top hat and coattails. Mao had contempt for everything traditionally Chinese. To a certain extent, the nationalist government is kind of weird. I think Sun Yat-sen was more of a liberal. Chiang Kai-shek was a lot more of a conservative, and I think he was kind of trying to blend them more together. But kind of by that point, China was just such a mess, and the nationalist government was so disjointed and corrupt, and just ideologically inconsistent. Whereas the communist government was just 100% committed and had very little corruption or treachery. So you kind of had these external powers, the U.S. and the USSR kind of using them as proxies. And ultimately, what kind of happened in China is you had Japan just rampage across it. The reason Japan didn't occupy more of China was just because it's hard to just hold the area regardless of how much better your army is. Just because it's a lot of people, it's a lot of land mass. A lot of the land isn't particularly useful. So more or less what happened was Japan occupied Manchuria in northeastern China, which is kind of where all the coal and steel and resources are. And a lot of kind of the coastal areas, which are kind of the wealthy agricultural parts. And Japan was just able to destroy them in every single battle. And because Japan modernized, they were able to beat them. When Russia went to war with Japan, they were able to destroy Russia in the war and gain land at Russia's expense. And that was kind of something that had never happened before. I think the British lost one of the Maratha Wars, but they weren't really fighting on their home turf. And I don't really know how committed they were to seeing that to the end. Whereas the Japanese were able to beat the Russians on their own land and to beat like their main fleets. So Japan was able to remain free of colonial powers. Granted, they were, particularly at the beginning of the Meiji Restoration, they had the unequal treaties and they were kind of subject to a large extent to Western countries. But as time came on, they became a great power and they were recognized as one, while still retaining a lot of the things that were quintessentially Japanese. At a time when China was going through communist and democratic revolutions. So throughout the world, we kind of have all these really old societies, these kind of, I guess you'd say, pure societies in Africa that were still tribal, that were still theocracies or absolute monarchies. You had the ultra-traditionalist Aztec and Incan empires and all these other kind of societies that would kind of be closer to the ideal of what kind of economic LARPers would have. But when they came across more modern states, they were utterly destroyed. And people say, well, modernism's degeneracy, RG. You can't say that. Well, okay, it may be degeneracy, but at least Japan stayed an independent country. At least they still had their emperor, they still had their sovereignty, they still had their culture. So they had to make some compromises and modernize. History's all about making compromise. That's kind of the reality of practical government. And societies that couldn't come to terms with the way the world was changing got destroyed, and then nothing of their culture remained. It was completely replaced, or it became some sort of bizarre chimera of Western and third world ideas, which is kind of one of the issues with Africa today. Kind of a lot of East Asian countries have succeeded in kind of keeping Asian values and kind of aspects of like meritocracy, corporatism, client patrons, rejection of unlimited democracy. They've succeeded in keeping a lot of what made their societies different intact. But a lot of countries have just become, like I said, this chimeric, dysfunctional, incomplete mixture of the two. And to a certain extent, that's an inability of the people to adapt how the world's changed. And when people say it's the current year, well, they mean it in a kind of a very dumb way, but to a certain extent, it is modernity. I mean, you can like it or hate it, but you can't put the genie back in the bottle. If we were all in the West to go, okay, modernity's degenerate, we're going to get rid of electricity, we're going to dismantle big corporations, we're going to just go back to farming, what do you think would happen? It might last a couple years. Do you think China economy strong is going to go, oh, there are all these resources in America and they no longer have any military? Do you think China is going to like not take advantage of that? I'm pretty sure they are. Or what's to say there isn't going to be another like major non-Western power who who doesn't disarm and doesn't become this idyllic agricultural society, and they don't invade the West and kick them out. I mean, that's what we did to people. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying that was kind of reality. We had Maxim guns and they had fucking spears and stuff. So just keep that in mind. That's kind of my criticism of economic LARPing, and I think you have to keep in mind. Sometimes you have to modernize, you have to make compromises to preserve the core of your society. And you might not like it, but I think practical concerns have to play a role in whatever it is you try to build. Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll talk to you again soon.